North Korea just launched a surprise missile strike at a US Navy destroyer. At first, it looked like the ship had no chance of surviving. But what happened in the next 5 minutes shocked everyone watching and changed the entire balance in the Pacific. At 7:42 a.m. under the quiet skies of the East Sea, North Korea fired a massive wave of ballistic and cruise missiles at the USS John Finn. Dozens of incoming tracks lit up the radar. For the crew, this was no drill. They had less than 3 minutes to react before impact. The attack wasn't random. Intelligence later showed that Pyongyang had been preparing for days. Camouflaged bunkers, mobile launchers hidden in forests, and submarines lurking under the waves. This was a coordinated strike designed to sink a US warship and send a message to Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. Inside the John Finn's Combat Information Center, alarms screamed as operators confirmed multiple inbound threats. "Bearing 270, speed Mach 6, one shouted. The officer of the deck's response was calm but firm. "This is not a drill." In seconds, the Aegis combat system was live, calculating firing solutions for interceptors. The ship's vertical launch cells opened, and SM-3 and SM-6 missiles thundered into the sky. Every second counted. On the radar, the first North Korean missiles arced upward and then began their deadly descent. At 7:44 a.m., the first wave was 3 long-range Hwasong-12 ballistic missiles, followed by 6 KN-23 short-range missiles, all designed to overwhelm defenses. But that wasn't all. Moments later, radar picked up low-altitude threats. Sea-skimming Kumong-3 anti-ship cruise missiles, launched from batteries hidden along the coast. It was a classic saturation strike. Overwhelmed the defenses with dozens of targets, coming from different angles, at different altitudes, and forced the destroyer to make impossible choices. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. The John Finn wasn't alone, but help was too far away. The USS Ronald Reagan carrier group was more than 300 miles out, while Allied South Korean destroyers Sejong the Great and Munmu the Great were just starting to maneuver into supporting positions. That meant the first line of defense fell entirely on the John Finn's crew. 300 sailors now stood between survival and disaster. Inside the CIC, tension was brutal. The crew knew they had seconds to respond. SM-3 interceptors screamed upward, detonating in flashes of light as they met incoming warheads in the upper atmosphere. One Hwasong missile shattered into fragments, falling harmlessly into the sea. Another was destroyed moments later, but not all. The KN-23s, flying unpredictable low arcs, slipped through gaps in the defense. One was on course to hit within 90 seconds. Close-in weapon systems roared to life, Gatling guns spitting thousands of tungsten rounds. A fireball lit the sky as one missile was shredded only 600 meters from the ship. The shockwave rocked the destroyer, rattling bolts and knocking sailors off balance. At 7:46 a.m., then it happened. One cruise missile broke through. It slammed into the port side of the John Finn just above the waterline. The explosion tore open steel plating, flooding compartments and throwing sailors across decks. Smoke poured into hallways. Damage control teams rushed in, sealing bulkheads and fighting fires as alarms blared. For the first time in the Pacific in decades, a US Navy destroyer had taken a direct hit from enemy fire, and this was only the beginning. Below the surface, a Gorai-class North Korean submarine fired a Pukguksong-3 missile from periscope depth. Its target wasn't the John Finn, but the South Korean destroyer Sejong the Great. The East Sea was no longer just a battleground of missiles in the sky. It had now turned into a fight across air, sea, and undersea, all at the same time. In Yokosuka, Japan, the U.S. 7th Fleet Operations Center scrambled to make sense of the chaos. Hours earlier, analysts had flagged unusual North Korean activity, but nothing had been confirmed. Now the reports were coming in. Multiple launches, confirmed hits, Allied ships in combat. It was no longer an exercise. The war had come alive. As missiles closed in, the destroyers fought back with everything they had. SM-6 interceptors, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, and Phalanx CIWS cannons fired in all directions. The sea lit up with fireballs as warheads detonated midair or splashed into the water. But the cost was mounting. the South Korean destroyer Munmu the Great took a direct hit on its helicopter deck, igniting aviation fuel and sending black smoke billowing skyward. The alliance was bleeding. But here's the part almost no one talks about. This wasn't just a strike against ships. It was a test of the entire US-South Korea alliance. Pyongyang believed it had found a weak point, a patrol out of position without immediate carrier support, and moved to exploit it. The John Finn was chosen not just as a target, but as a symbol. If it sank, it would shake confidence across the region and prove that US promises of protection were fragile. By 7:48 a.m., the John Finn's crew was fighting for survival. Flooding had been slowed, but the ship was still taking on water. More missiles were inbound. Every decision mattered. If even one more slipped through, it could mean the end of the ship. The destroyer was battered, but not broken. Reinforcements were on the way, and in the skies above, F-35B fighters from the USS America and South Korean jets screamed toward the battle zone. The fight was about to turn. The first wave of the attack had nearly crippled the Allied ships, but the battle was far from finished. As smoke and flames poured from damaged decks, the next chapter began. High above the East Sea, F-35B Lightning II fighters from the USS America entered the fight. Their arrival changed everything. Flying low and fast, they locked onto North Korean missile batteries still launching from the coast. Precision-guided missiles streaked toward their targets. In seconds, 2 coastal launch sites exploded in fireballs, secondary detonations confirming hidden stockpiles of ammunition had been destroyed. The air war had begun. At the same time, South Korean radar operators detected more launches near Hamhung. 4 additional Hwasong ballistic missiles were rising into the sky. Another Gorai-class submarine, undetected until this point, released 2 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The plan was relentless. Staggered waves of missiles designed to exhaust the defenders. For the American and South Korean ships, this was survival under constant pressure. Interceptors fired again, tearing through the sky in arcs of flame. Some connected, destroying threats hundreds of kilometers above the sea. Others slipped past, forcing desperate last-second defenses. The South Korean destroyer Munmu the Great, already burning from a previous hit, was struck again. A ballistic missile slammed into the rear section, blasting apart its helicopter hangar. Fire raged across the deck as sailors scrambled to contain it. The ship, though heavily damaged, refused to sink. With escort from a nearby frigate, it began retreating from the engagement zone. The alliance was down to 2 active combat ships, one of them severely damaged. For the John Finn, the fight was brutal. Flooding from the earlier strike had been slowed, but fires still burned deep inside the hull. Every new missile track on radar meant another chance of disaster. Yet, through sheer determination and advanced systems, the destroyer held. 2 more ballistic missiles were intercepted before they could reach terminal phase. An incoming cruise missile was shredded by a Sea Sparrow missile just seconds before impact. The battle was a constant exchange. One side launching, the other side intercepting. The margin for error measured in seconds. At 8 a.m., with reinforcements overhead, the tide began to shift. F-35s launched long-range anti-ship missiles aimed at the North Korean coastline. AGM-158 CLR-ASMS streaked in low, skimming the waves before slamming into fortified batteries. Explosions lit the coastline, throwing fire and debris high into the air. At least 3 missile sites were silenced in rapid succession. For the first time since the attack began, the missile count on radar began to fall, but the submarines remained a threat. Sonar operators detected torpedoes in the water, launched by a North Korean Gorai-class sub. The John Finn executed emergency maneuvers while countermeasures fired into the sea. Decoys exploded, luring 2 torpedoes away. A third detonated nearby, rocking the ship but sparing it from a direct hit. Helicopters from the Sejong the Great deployed sonar buoys, hunting the submarine. Within minutes, depth charges detonated below, and sonar picked up the faint echo of a vessel breaking apart. 1 submarine had been eliminated. Another was still out there. The East Sea was chaos. Smoke hung over the waves. Flaming wreckage floated on the water. But the Allied defense was stabilizing. Missile launches from North Korea slowed as more of their batteries were destroyed. Air superiority was now firmly in Allied hands, with F-35s circling overhead, ready to strike any new target. For the John Finn, survival was no longer the only mission. It was now striking back. Cruise missiles launched from the destroyer arced toward the North Korean coast, hitting radar installations and command bunkers. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition depots had been struck. Each hit reduced the capacity of North Korea to continue the assault. At the same time, B-1B bombers flying in from Guam entered the region, releasing long-range standoff missiles that targeted deeper infrastructure. Command centers, fuel depots, and hardened bunkers lit up in fireballs visible for miles. The retaliation had begun. At 8:15 a.m., by the quarter hour, the main exchange was over. The John Finn remained afloat, battered but still combat-capable. Fires were contained, flooding was under control, and radar systems were still functional. The Sejong the Great had intercepted its share of incoming missiles and was still battle-ready. Munmu the Great was scarred but stable, escorted away for emergency repair. The skies above were secured, with Allied aircraft maintaining dominance. The East Sea was littered with debris, the remains of intercepted missiles, and smoke rising from destroyed batteries along the North Korean coast. The cost had been high. One Allied destroyer crippled, another damaged, and dozens of sailors injured. But the alliance had survived the storm. For Pyongyang, the outcome was far different than planned. The strike had been meant to cripple the U.S. presence and fracture the alliance. Instead, it had proven the resilience of joint defense. North Korea had bloodied its opponents, but it had also exposed the full might of Allied response. The attack was more than a battle at sea. It was a political signal. Pyongyang wanted to prove it could strike directly at U.S. and South Korean forces and win. Instead, it demonstrated both capability and vulnerability. Yes, it could launch hundreds of missiles. But once the defenses held and retaliation began, it could not stop the overwhelming response. For the sailors aboard the John Finn, the memory of those minutes would last forever. The moment when alarms screamed, missiles filled the skies, and survival hung by a thread. For the region, the message was unmistakable. The Pacific had just witnessed one of the most dangerous confrontations in decades. A direct missile exchange between North Korea and US-led forces played out in real time over the East Sea. The world had been one step away from escalation into full-scale war. And that's the most chilling part. This wasn't the end. It was only the first strike in what could become a much larger conflict. The question now wasn't whether North Korea could hit a US ship. It was how far the next exchange might go, and whether anyone would be able to stop it before the Pacific slid into all-out war.